there, and thanks for joining us on Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight, Evanston's groundbreaking reparations program is facing a legal challenge. Students who live in close proximity to a homicide often suffer in the classroom afterwards. How schools can mitigate the impact. And in a historic move, Negro League stats are officially part of Major League's baseball records. And now to some of today's top stories. Governor J.B. Pritzker touted some fiscal successes today while signing the state's new $53 billion budget into law.
The rainy day fund that was once near zero will see a nearly 10% increase and is now on track to reach a record $2.3 billion. Our state's pension funded ratio is headed for another positive improvement. The state's accounts payable is near a 21st century low, and nearly all of our short-term debt has been eliminated.
Pritzker was joined by the lieutenant governor and Democratic leaders in the General Assembly to sign the budget for fiscal year 2025. The spending plan includes funding increases for education and creates a new Department of Early Childhood. It also has more money for homelessness, safety net hospitals, and nursing homes. Republicans, though, declared the state's largest ever budget bloated. For more budget reaction and what didn't make it into the spending plan, please check out our website. Former Alderman Ed Burke was back in federal court today, this time to ask a judge to toss out his racketeering conviction from December. The once powerful chair of the City Council Finance Committee was convicted by a jury on 13 of 14 counts of racketeering, bribery, and attempted extortion. But in court today, his attorneys argued that the jury was, quote, carried away and focused on 3 of the 4 criminal schemes that Burke was convicted of orchestrating. U.S. District Court Judge Virginia Kendall said she'd issue a written order shortly. The WNBA today is reportedly rescinding a controversial call in last night's Chicago Sky game. The Sky were trailing the New York Liberty in the 4th quarter when rookie star Angel Reese was called for a personal foul and then ejected, leaving players and fans confused. After the game, the lead official said Reese received 2 technical fouls triggering an ejection. The first, he said, was for, quote, disrespectfully addressing the official, and the second was for waving off the official in resentment to the call. The Chicago Sun-Times reports the WNBA rescinded the second technical, dropping Reese's fine from $400 to $200. Up next, why a groundbreaking reparations program is facing a court challenge right after this.
Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, is made possible in part by the support of these donors.
Evanston's groundbreaking reparations program is now facing a legal challenge. The program is aimed at addressing housing discrimination and segregation that took place in the northern suburb from 1919 to 1969. The city's original plan was to distribute funds to eligible black households in the form of $25,000 payments for home repairs, down payments, or interest or late penalties owed to the city. The measure has since expanded to include direct cash payments that can be used at recipients' discretion. But that program is now under fire as a class action lawsuit is challenging the city's use of race as an eligibility requirement. Joining us now with more are one of the attorneys representing the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, attorney Christine Svensson, and joining us via Zoom, Justin Hansford, a law professor at Howard University. We should mention we did invite the city of Evanston, but they declined to join, but said in a statement, quote, "We will vehemently defend any lawsuit brought against our city's reparations program." I thank the two of you, Christine and Justin, for joining us. Christine Svensson, let's start with you, please. What is the legal argument against the reparations program?
So first of all, Brandis, I just want to thank you for having me. I filed this lawsuit in conjunction with Judicial Watch, Inc., which is a government accountability law firm based in Washington, D.C. And I'd also like to state for the record that the evils of slavery and more recently the evils of redlining are terrible things, and they're extremely, I understand why the city of Evanston did this to redress those wrongs. However, the problem is that the city of Evanston has now put themselves in the business of choosing winners and losers because they are using race as a proxy to make government handouts, and that is violative of the 14th of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Now, according to the lawsuit, you all say remedying societal discrimination is not a compelling governmental interest.
That's right. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated so definitively in Richmond versus Croson. That was, I believe, in 1989. They considered it's not this exact issue, but basically, and of course it's been revisited with the affirmative action case, the Students for Free Admissions case that recently was handed down. That decision was handed down last year. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that they are not in the business of remedying societal discrimination.
Justin Hansford, I want to get you in here. What is your reaction to this lawsuit and to parts of Christine's argument?
Sure. So, this is a bigger conversation around the meaning of the 14th Amendment. There are some people who believe that on July 9th, 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, that there was no specific effort to try to use that 14th Amendment to reintegrate formerly enslaved people into American society or to advocate for the end of racial injustice specifically by identifying those who had been harmed by racism and providing a remedy for that. Some people say that instead, the 14th Amendment said we should close our eyes and be blind to race. And that's a big mistake in terms of reading the 14th Amendment. Here we see the mistake that continues to bear rotten fruit with this idea that you cannot provide a particular remedy for not a broad societal harm in an abstract way, which is what people are saying happened in Evanston, but we have a very particularized, concrete report done by the city of Evanston explicitly articulating how this policy, which between 1919 and 1969 was aimed at harming Black citizens in particular, has continued to impact the ongoing wealth gap in the city of Evanston. And this is a policy, of course, that we saw happening all across the country in the 20th century. So there are implications that are national here. But I think that the two mistakes in the thinking are, number one, the mistake of feeling that the 14th Amendment is asking us to blind ourselves to reality and pretend that racism can be addressed through color blindness. And I think that is not the original intent of the 14th Amendment. And secondly, I think the mistake is feeling that this particular program and all of these programs for repair for particular specific harms that were outlined in explicit detail are the equivalent of abstract societal approaches to try to end the discrimination in the country writ large. I think those are two.
So, Christine, part of your suit argues that people who are eligible for the reparations payments only have to meet certain criteria as far as when their ancestors may have lived in Evanston and their current age today, but that they don't have to prove that they or their Evanston ancestors were discriminated against. Should that be necessary, that there is the proof that they were discriminated against somehow, particularly in the realm of housing? That is the first section of the city's program.
So it should be, and U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence has stated as such. And now we're talking about another prong involved here, which is the fact that not only must there be a compelling government interest, but also that that interest must be met in a narrowly tailored fashion. And in this instance, correct, the program does not limit eligibility to people who have actually experienced discrimination. In addition, more race-neutral means could have been utilized by the city of Evanston insofar as they could have asked for people to provide proof of housing discrimination, and they did not. So it's overly broad. It should have been much more, this ordinance should have been much more narrowly tailored to achieve their goals.
Justin, does it seem to you, for those of you who are involved in putting some of these programs together, were you all prepared and expecting these lawsuits? And do you see this one as sort of an outgrowth of several lawsuits around the country in a post-affirmative action reality?
No, I do not see this as an outgrowth of other lawsuits that target affirmative action, because affirmative action is completely different from lawsuits. Affirmative action is about promoting diversity, and it is completely separate from the process of providing a remedy for a particular harm. And let's take it just really quickly. Let's do one quick reality check. If you're a African American in 1919 who wanted to get a mortgage in the city of Evanston, and the city has acknowledged that they had an explicit agreement to not give you that mortgage, how are we bringing a lawsuit 2024 is saying that you have to prove as a descendant of that Black person that you were discriminated against? We're going to have a starting point assuming that you weren't discriminated against in 1919 as a Black person in the city of Evanston. And the city is basically telling you in its report that no, we specifically said all Blacks are barred from having homes in this particular region of our town, period. So it's hard for us to really take the colorblindness concept and apply it to reality, because it calls for such a stretching of what is real in life. It really.
So you're saying even the city acknowledged that it was discriminating against Black people for a time period well after slavery, actually. But Christine, do you think governments can do anything? Can they make up for past racially discriminatory practices without taking race into account?
No, I mean, they can't. And I might disagree with my friend, because I'm not certain that it is clear that it was the city of Evanston that discriminated against African Americans. One could argue that it was the banks, or that it was the mortgage lenders, and perhaps maybe
the federal government,
or the FHA. Perhaps they should consider lawsuits against them. But I think there are causation issues with suing the city of Evanston. I would also say that one talks about injustice, but how is it just for the taxpayer of Evanston, someone who's lived there for 10 years, perhaps someone who even came from another country? Why is it just for them to remedy these wrongs? They had nothing to do with it. Their ancestors weren't even there. So now we're asking for people that had nothing to do with these wrongs to actually pay for it, because the Evanston taxpayer, it's paid for with home rule taxpayer dollars. It's directly coming out of those Evanstonians that live there right now.
Justin, we've got 30 seconds left. I'll let you respond to that.
Sure. Well, my first reaction is I'm glad that there's an acknowledgement that the banks and the mortgage companies and the FHA are also at fault here. So I'm glad that my friend concedes that there is multiple possibilities in terms of providing redress for this wrong. And I know that, my tax dollars have paid for everything from recovery from hurricanes in Florida that I didn't cause. My tax dollars go to Ukraine. I didn't cause that conflict. There are a lot of things my tax dollars go to solve in the world that I didn't cause. I think that's a misunderstanding of how our government works. We're trying to make things right in this society and trying to be more righteous and be on the good side and the right side of history. I'm glad that we're part of this positive step moving forward. And I think many of the people of Evanston are glad as well.
All right, I'm glad we're having this conversation. Obviously, there's more to come. That's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to Christine Svensson and Justin Hansford for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Up next, the impact violence has on students in the classroom. Tomorrow is the last day of school for Chicago's public school students. And while summer break is a time to reboot and refresh, it's also when violence typically spikes in the city. A new study from the University of Chicago says CPS students who live in close proximity to a homicide often suffer in the classroom afterwards. But the study also examines ways schools can mitigate the impact that violence has on kids. WTTW News reporter Matt Masterson joins us now with more. Matt, What did the study find about how many students this is impacting?
Yeah, so the study looked at the school years between 2010-11 and 2018-19, and it found that during that time, about 1 in 5 Chicago Public School students who lived within 0.2 miles or about 2 blocks of a homicide during that time frame. 6% of students during that time frame actually experienced multiple homicides within a single year, and it was students who lived in the lowest economic areas of the city who were most likely to live in close proximity to a homicide. The report also found that it was black students who were more likely than their peers to live within that short distance of a shooting or homicide.
6% experiencing multiple homicides in a single year. What was the impact in the classroom?
Well, the study found that students who did live within that very tight proximity, on average, saw lower attendance rates, lower standardized test scores, and lower GPA after that homicide compared to how they were doing in school beforehand. It also became more likely that these particular students would have some sort of behavioral issue in school, like a suspension or an expulsion following a homicide in their neighborhood. But this didn't happen to everyone, and students who did live within this close proximity, they didn't all experience this the same exact way, and that's where the school comes into effect. That's what the report found, that the school had more of an impact on helping some students than others based on what they were doing there.
And what can schools do to address it?
Well, there's actually several things. Students attending schools that had stronger climates, stronger cultures, were less likely to see these negative outcomes. Building trust among students, among themselves, and among students and educators and staff at the school also led to better outcomes. I spoke with one of the study authors, David Johnson, who told me that there's no silver bullet strategy to fixing all this, but schools that had well-coordinated support systems, that had things like behavioral health teams, were less likely to see negative impacts after a shooting. CPS, of course, is in the process of rewriting its whole school safety plans this summer, and it's focusing on a more holistic approach centered on things like emotional safety and relational trust between students and staff. And Johnson told me he believes that this study that they just published this week helps support the district's approach in those regards.
Okay, Matt Masterson, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Matt's full story on our website. It's all at WTTW.com/news. Thousands of Negro League baseball players are finally getting their due. 77 years after the legendary Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball. Last week, MLB announced it would add stats from the Negro Leagues to its records to, quote, correct a longtime error. As a result, 35 players from the league are now part of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And joining us now with more are Fred Mitchell, veteran sports reporter and journalism professor at DePaul University. And on Zoom, we have Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, located in Kansas City, Missouri. Thanks to you both for joining us. Bob Kendrick, starting with you, please. Why is this happening now? What took so long?
Well, a lot of people did not know that in 1969, Major League Baseball had a special commission that looked at the various professional leagues that had operated in this country. And of course, the Negro Leagues had been blatantly disregarded. And in 2020, December of 2020, Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred made the historic announcement that first and foremost, that Major League Baseball would recognize the Negro Leagues to be, quite frank, what we already knew it to be, a major league, and that it would then work to roll in the statistics from the Negro Leagues into the annals of Major League Baseball's record books. Last week, after some diligent work by what I call a dream team of Negro League historians and researchers, that quantitative data was brought forth and officially entered into the record books of Major League Baseball. And to be honest, it's been changing.
Yeah, it's made some changes too. We're going to come back to that in a second. Fred, if you would remind us briefly how the Negro Leagues formed.
Well, obviously, African Americans, minorities were not allowed to play in the major leagues. Their love for the game of baseball kind of overlooked that fact, and it was such a popular game in America's pastime, right? And here in Chicago, for instance, at the old Comiskey Park, they would draw like 50,000 fans for Negro League All-Star games and such. So, you know, fortunately, I guess you'd say, we were able to see former Negro League players like Ernie Banks and Hank Aaron and Willie Mays and all the people that, all the names that people are very familiar with, started out in the Negro Leagues. And so people got a glimpse of the quality of play in the Negro Leagues because, oh, I know who Ernie Banks is. I know who Willie Mays. I know Hank Aaron and what they did. So this is a wonderful, long overdue acknowledgement of the great players in that league.
They were really popular, as you said. Bob, Major League Baseball says that getting to this point was a bit complicated because of the data that was collected by the two different leagues. It was, different data, not quite apples to apples. Explain for us what some of those complications were and briefly how they worked it out.
Well, as I tell people anecdotally, I'm not going to say that finding this information was the equivalent of finding a needle in a haystack, but it damn near was. And that's why I commend those historians, because they've been doing this for decades. They've been doing this research for decades. It was just the last 3 years that they were asked to pull together this particular project. And this meant going through and finding box scores and newspaper clippings, primarily through those black papers that were so prevalent during that time. They were the voice of the Negro Leagues. And to be honest, had it not been for the black press, we would know very little about the history of the Negro Leagues. But this meant going back, because these records go from 1920 until 1948. So essentially a year after integration. And there's still work left to be done. And hopefully we'll see that time span expand slightly, as well as they continue this diligent work of unearthing this information. But I tip my cap to that team because they did yeoman's duty to pull this information together.
Yeah, you got to be pretty good at math, I guess. Bob, these changes, they also mean some historical changes, as we mentioned. So now Josh Gibson is the league's all-time leader in batting average, surpassing Ty Cobb, slugging percentage, all-time leader in slugging percentage, surpassing Babe Ruth, and on-base slugging percentage. So what other revelations or changes does this sort of integration create?
Well, it's been seen, embraced by a lot, and then jeered by some, because the fact that Josh Gibson, and as you just mentioned, he's a top of a number of major statistical categories. He had 466 in 1943. That is a single season all-time batting record. His lifetime batting average, as you mentioned, of 372, moved him ahead of Ty Cobb. And in the minds of many who adhere to this belief that because this league was black, that it had to be inferior to the league that they were not allowed to play in, it is a hard pill to swallow. But I've been telling people all along that these guys in the Negro Leagues, as my friend, the late great Buck O'Neill, who spent many years there in Chicago as a coach, as a scout, and then as the first black coach in Major League Baseball history with the Chicago Cubs, as he would say, we could play, and they could. No, we shouldn't be surprised by these numbers, but people will want to poke holes in them, but these numbers are very valid.
Putting it very simply, we could play. Fred, though, when you hear about, the Negro League players and how they stack up to the Major League players and that they were left out of these calculations all these years, what does that say to you about the players and the teams?
Well, first of all, this is kind of a personal story for me. I had two uncles who played. One played some with the Chicago American Giants. Austin Tillotson, another Uncle Astrid Tillotson, played in a lot of barnstorming games, got a hit off of Dizzy Dean in East Chicago, Indiana. And my father played on some semi-pro teams, all black teams that played against some of these Negro League stars. So I would hear growing up all these years how great these guys were. Oh, you should have seen this guy play. Josh Gibson, he was the greatest. So it was all, anecdotal at that time. There was no television. You couldn't watch them. There was very little footage of that. So now this is finally an acknowledgement that, yes, they played. Yes, they were great. Yes, they did what they did and deserve all the accolades that they had. And as I mentioned earlier, everybody has seen, the Ernie Banks and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and saw how well they performed in both leagues.
So on June 20th, the San Francisco Giants will play the St. Louis Cardinals at Rickwood Field. That is a historic Negro Leagues site in Alabama, I believe. First, are you guys taking any bets? I'm kidding. Bob, this one to you first, though. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to see the field honored this way?
Oh, it's going to be another milestone moment because Rickwood Field, as you just alluded to, so much history was made there. It was home to both the Birmingham Barons, the white professional team, and the Birmingham Black Barons, the old Negro League team. And in a Bull Connor segregated, deeply segregated Birmingham, the Black Barons were the toast of the town. Yeah,
right,
they got more ink. Yeah, they got more ink than the Barons did, and they outthrew the Barons.
Gentlemen,
because they were better than the Barons.
I'm sure they were, but I wasn't there. We could talk about this all day. I wish I could, but I have to leave it there. My thanks to Bob Kendrick and Fred Mitchell for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's our show tonight. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10 for Chicago Tonight Latino Voices. Meet the first Mexican-born woman to travel to space and hear about her new mission inspiring girls. And Pride Month is officially here. We explore how Latino communities are celebrating. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, which is proud to honor founder and senior partner Robert Clifford, who has been named in Forbes' 2024 list of America's top 200 lawyers.